Welcome to Lecture 17, Industrial America, an age in which steel and the railroad will supplant and replace farming, that Jeffersonian agricultural paradise that was the dream and goal of early Americans will disappear, not entirely, but will certainly lose its political power and its ability to capture Americans' minds as we enter an age of steel and skyscraper and industrial work. This lecture is quite large, so it will be split into separate sections to make it easier to find the section you're looking for. Our first section will be on the origins of industrialization itself. So, as I hinted at, this is an age of steel and oil and coal, the new fuels and materials of the industrial age, an age of factories and workers in those factories laboring away, and the machines that will make modern America. Between 1870 and 1900, the United States undergoes a second industrial revolution. So the first one would be the one we talked about in the antebellum period, with the first factories like Lowell, the textile factories, Slater's Mills, for example. This is a second industrial revolution, and its focus really will be steel and the production, large mass-scale production of what we think of as modern America, an urban America, an America of mass-produced goods. So let's take a look at the factors that made this possible and then the consequences of this dramatic economic change in the United States. Causes will be first. First of all, there will be innovations in business structures to create monopolies. And I'll have more to say about this at a later point in the lecture. But suffice it to say that the mom and pop family-owned business is not the business of the Gilded Age. Sure, those do exist, and we have plenty of them, minor corporations that get created after the Civil War. But they will rapidly be swallowed up by large-scale enterprises. Production of steel and control over oil, even sugar. The monopoly for sugar in the United States controls 98% of all sugar production by 1895. The United States government is pro-business. One of the legacies, the long-term legacies of the Whigs and the Republican Party is a pro-business environment. And that environment suggests to entrepreneurs, take a risk, get out there. The government will be behind you, whether it's through legislation that will be pro-business or whether through it's the courts that will interpret laws in ways to become pro-business. There's an abundant supply of labor. Lots of Americans willing to work for cheap, and even more Americans coming into the country. In this time period, there'll be about 22 million migrants coming into the United States, and they will all be willing to work for next to nothing just for the promise of making it in America. You can see here from this map that a lot of the industrial production that we think about in this time period is concentrated in the Midwest and the Mid-Atlantic, the urbanized areas associated with New York and Philly, Pittsburgh, and Cleveland. So Ohio becomes one of those places, Indiana along Lake Michigan and Chicago. Not so much going on down in the South. The South does have some industrial capacity, and we'll talk about what that looks like a little bit later on in the lecture. But this is where industry is going to take off in the United States. and produce the modern America that we associate with this time period. It is a time period in which even children will work. These are young boys in a factory, probably the age of 14 or 15, and that was not uncommon in this age for poor children to obtain these factory jobs and to be paid pretty low wages. But it's the difference between starving to death and not starving to death that drives the poor to work in these conditions. We'll talk more about the conditions in a later part of the lecture, and they're not great. America also has abundant natural resources. Being the size of the United States as it is, there are plenty of resources to extract. Water resources, you have timber resources, iron for making steel, copper, out west. All of the resources that we need for the most part for this industrial age are here. And you can see that those resources quickly get turned into rapid economic change. I mentioned this is an age of industry and that farming takes a back seat to industry, but it's not like farming goes away. After all, with a growing population, people still need to eat. So farms increase in size and production to feed the growing hungry mouths of this industrial age. And of course, farms are not immune to industry as well, with the coming of mechanization, tractors and harvesters and threshers and other kinds of agricultural implements. People are increasing in the working force, so go from 2.5 million to 5.9 million. Agriculture does overall lose. So 52% of people are in agriculture in 1870, but it's only 27% by 1920. Industry goes from 29 to 44. Retail, service, trade, administration increases from 20 to 27. America massively increases its output of steel, 0.8 thousand tons to 11.2 tons to 46 tons. And overall, the per capita gross national product, the amount per person produced in the United States, will increase pretty dramatically, 371 to 707 in $1920. People even live longer in this age, despite it being a difficult time period to live in. Another thing that makes America successful, industrially speaking, is the amount of technological innovation that results in patents for new inventions. American inventors get really busy solving technical and industrial problems, filing for patents in order to protect their inventions. And so this is an age of invention. Thomas Edison is probably the name most associated with this time period. Giving us the light bulb, the phonograph. We get the Kodak camera, the telephone, Alexander Graham Bell, barbed wire, refrigerator, railroad cars. You name it, Americans invent it and they make it better in thousands and thousands of patents applied for in this era. How many patents? Well, I can show you graphically. You can see in the decade just before the Civil War, only 19,000 patents. In the decade of the Civil War and after, that more than doubles to 64,000. And then it doubles again to 124,000, 1870, 1879, and then 195,000, and then 221,000 patents. Americans are inventive. And there is an economist who has argued that the reason why this century, this part of the century, the 19th century, was so economically dominant in terms of growth was because of these inventions that allowed Americans to sail to the head of the class, as it were, and become the number one industrial nation on earth by 1900. One such invention that you have probably never, ever, ever heard of, but nonetheless dramatically changes life in the South, is the automatic cigarette rolling machine. James Bonsack is the inventor of that, and it is a game changer for the production of cigarettes and tobacco in the South. Tobacco had kind of died down as a major component of the Southern economy. After all, you can produce it, but as long as you've got to hand roll and hand pack and do everything by hand, you can't really mass produce that product. But then, of course, a machine that will automatically produce cigarettes can suddenly spread lung cancer to everyone at a fraction of the cost that it was before. And so this will be a game changer in particularly states like North Carolina, where the Duke family will become the heads of a tobacco empire that will reach all the way to China. I think it's also important to note that another reason for this dramatic technological, economic, industrial growth is the ability to communicate and cross distance in a way that had not been able to be done before. The fact that Americans could send phone messages after 1876, the fact that railroads crisscrossed and connected the country allowed for the rapid exchange of goods and also the rapid exchange of information. Shrinking distance is going to rapidly speed up the pace of business in this time period. So this is one area that cannot really be downplayed. Historians have many times argued that, in fact, the railroads were the first big business of this new industrial age. And I have more to say about them a little bit later. So we've talked about Transcontinental Railroad before, numerous other railroads, which originated as individual and separate lines, soon start to get connected and we get a nationwide rail network. But the names that are attached to these individual lines, like the Hudson River, the New York Central, the Erie, the Baltimore and Ohio, or B&O, kind of get still referenced here and there. If you're playing a game of Monopoly, for example, the Baltimore and Ohio, the B&O Railroad on the Monopoly board. And that's a throwback to the days when railroads were such a big part of American life. You really can't underestimate how much trains impacted Americans' imaginations. This engine, this symbol of progress, the symbol of American power, American ingenuity, American conquest of space, was such a powerful reminder for Americans at just how far they had come. You know, we take the car for granted because of what it does in our world. For Americans in the 19th century, it was the railroad. Now, finally, some consequences. If you have all these massive and consequential changes in the economy, certainly it's going to affect the lives of Americans. It's going to affect the economic history of the United States. So what are those consequences? Number one, extremes of wealth. The period after the Civil War will see the rise of America's first billionaires, extremely wealthy people who were so wealthy and so powerful that no one like them had existed before in American history. And Americans, of course, are simultaneously fascinated but also disgusted by these wealthy gentlemen that get nicknamed robber barons. And it leads to a lot of political conflict, debates over, is this good for the United States that these people are so wealthy? Some of these people are so wealthy that they make more money in a year than individual states do. And they're so wealthy that they are able to command vast sums of money that make Uncle Sam look impoverished. And a lot of Americans, we'll see later on the lecture, ask questions like, is this healthy? Is this good? Is this somehow a threat to the simple Republican equality that our founders envisioned for us? Indeed, if you look at these men and their wealth in 2022 dollars, you can see that they even sometimes make our modern day robber barons, the Elon Musks, the Bill Gates of our world, look like paupers in comparison. We don't exactly know how much money these men really had. It's not like they had to release a statement telling the world exactly how wealthy they were. So we have to estimate based on what available sources we've got. Andrew Carnegie, 350 billion. John D. Rockefeller, 395 billion. J.P. Morgan, a pitiful 48 billion in comparison to Rockefeller. Vanderbilt, 243 billion. Henry Ford, 237 billion. Philip Armour, you might not know him, but if you walk by the meat section in your grocery store, there's a good chance you'll see Armour hot dogs or Armour bacon. James B. Duke, the head of the lung cancer tobacco producing empire in North Carolina. And then Leland J. Stanford. These men were incredibly wealthy. And they, of course, have left their names to us in numerous ways so that we would never forget them. Carnegie attached to libraries, Rockefeller to Rockefeller Plaza, and the Rockefeller charities and endowments. J.P. Morgan as in J.P. Morgan Chase. Vanderbilt's names attached to Vanderbilt University. Henry Ford for cars. Duke University. And Leland Stanford University. So we still very much have these guys with us because they were not only rich, they wanted to leave a legacy and a reminder to Americans of their power that they held in this age. One of the consequences of that power was political corruption. It turns out that people with extreme amounts of wealth do not often feel like the law applies to them. Go figure that someone with the ability to buy their way out of any situation feels no necessary desire to follow the law at all times. After all you got to do is bend the law with your enormous amounts of money, buy politicians, buy influence. And we see that happening in this post-Civil War period. Corruption skyrockets in this time period. And we'll talk more about that later. A lot of Americans agreed with this cartoonist that, in fact, the corruption reached all the way up into the highest levels of government, that individual senators of the U.S. Senate were bought and paid for by these robber barons whose vast sums of money allowed them to get whatever they wanted. As we are told, hopefully from a very young age, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. We might amend that to also remind ourselves that money can be incredibly corrupting as well when it allows you to buy whatever you want. In this age of vast industrial production, there's also vast pollution and environmental damage. And a lot of the people at this time don't really think that's a problem. It takes them a few years to realize, if we cut down all the trees, there won't be any forests left. And it's a good while before that really hits a lot of them. They don't realize that all of the material they're dumping into their rivers is polluting them. So railroads and factories are doing untold damage to the environment. And I had a student a few years ago do a paper on this and found out that one of the first groups to realize it, one of the first groups, in fact, to notice climate change were farmers because all of the carbon being spewed into the environment in this age was altering weather patterns, and farmers were the ones who paid most attention to that in this time period. Cities became covered in large amounts of smog and dirt, nasty, polluted air. I once did a research study on Pittsburgh and found that Pittsburgh's coal steel production was an enormous source of dirt and filth in the city that would make it so dark that it would look like nighttime in the middle of the afternoon. People had to keep their windows closed so that the soot did not drift into their houses and cover all of their furniture. There were places like in Cleveland where the rivers were so polluted that they would catch on fire from the amount of debris and pollutants floating in them. And because of this rapid and very, very powerful economic growth, we will see the economy start to go through more frequent boom-bust cycles. In early America, you could expect a panic good every 10 to 12 years. So there's small dips. 1792 has one, 1807 has one, then not again until 1819, and then not again until 1837. There's a small business panic in 1857. So good, 10 to 12 years or so in early America. But in the post-Civil War era, the economy will rapidly go up and crash a lot quicker. So there will be a panic in 1873. There will be a decline in 1884, 1885, 1893, 1907, and of course a big giant one will occur in 1929, a small one in 1918, 1919, after World War I. And it's because these businesses are so big that when they fail, they catastrophically affect the economy. Multiple of these panics are caused by businesses going bankrupt in an already weakened economic situation. And then all those people lose their jobs, the business can't pay back its debts, and pretty soon it drags the rest of the economy down with it. You can see here from this chart these business cycles. So there's an expansion and then the decline. The decline's pretty bad here for the 1873 one. You can see it lasts almost until 1880. And then it'll pick back up, another boom, and then the depression again, 1884, 1885, and then another boom again, and then another huge panic. It's as if America's economy is on a roller coaster with an increasing number of falls and rises. And we can also point to the fact that this economy is much more connected than the pre-Civil War economy. We get fully national connected markets where products that are made in one part of the United States are sold everywhere in the United States. I mean, one of the first mass marketed products toward the end of this age is the You Need a Biscuit. It's a saltine cracker that comes in a tin. The tin is advertised to keep the crackers fresh. And that company that makes it today is known as Nabisco, the National Biscuit Company. They're the ones also, too, who will adopt graham crackers and add some sugar to them and a little bit of spice in order to sell them to Americans as well. These products can be bought everywhere. People start recognizing brand names that you can get all across the United States. One of the more interesting ones that I study is medicines. And medicines become recognized because people want to know that this is a medicine that they can trust. So if you are having a backache, You go for Doan's backache pills, which, by the way, had a laxative in them. Most people had backaches because they were constipated. Overnight cough relief was a widely marketed cough medicine, and it worked because it had opium, morphine, and alcohol, and sometimes cannabis in it. So people would look for these brand names, trust this name, sold all the way across the United States because it will be good for you. But fully interconnected markets meant that companies were largely now dominating all of American life. Chances were good in the Gilded Age that if you bought your kerosene to light your lamps in your home, you bought it from Standard Oil. It controlled roughly about 90% of the American oil market. And that kind of power will lead Americans to wonder if it is a good thing for us to have these businesses with so much reach and so much influence. In fact, one of the dominant images for businesses in this time period will be that of a multi-tentacled monster. But Americans were willing to tolerate that because, broadly speaking, there's an improvement in the standard of living. And that is measured by Americans' ability to mass consume consumer goods. Both Foner and plenty of other historians who studied this time period will point to a changing definition of citizenship in the United States that says that Americans are able to enjoy the fruits of American prosperity because they are able to buy these consumer goods. Buying things is a mark of now your quality of life. So you can go buy a cheap, pre-made, mass-produced product at any store or order it in a catalog, and that somehow shows that the American life is a good life for you. That this new standard of living, however minor it is that it is increased, is somehow better than what was before. And it was a marker of the fact that you had the good American life, the American way. No product measured this perhaps more effectively than the Sears Roebuck catalog, which allowed people, even in the tiniest little rural areas, to look at thousands and thousands of products. Young children could just look over the pages and pages of toys and just think, oh, I want that. And that would become a measure of the good American life. We have this cornucopia of things spilling out for us. In the next part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about the ways in which big business organized itself and how it was able to successfully grow to be so huge. So we're going to talk a little bit about business organization in this section. The big problem of this Gilded Age for businesses was competition. Now, we normally think of competition as a good thing. Competing means that there's a multitude of products. Companies try to get our attention with the best product they can offer. But businesses see competition as the enemy. If you produce steel and I produce steel, you're my enemy. So a lot of the business growth of this era comes from businesses simply crushing their competitors. This is a process called horizontal integration. If I make steel, I try to put you out of business and buy your steel company. And that way, I can control more of the market for steel. Between 1895 and 1905, this led to what was known as a Great Merger movement. A movement of the consolidation of many hundreds of minor, smaller companies into larger and larger company groups, such that we get huge monopolies that control say 98% of all sugar production in the case of the sugar market in the United States. But that wasn't the only way that businesses grew large in this time period. Many businesses wanted to control not just what they made, but everything that they needed to make that product, the entire supply chain, as it's called. So let's say I do make steel. It's in my best interest to conquer my competitor, who also makes steel, and take over his steel company. But I also want control over all my own iron mines. I don't want to buy iron from people and have to depend on the price that they charge me. I want to own my own mines. I want to own my own workers who I can put into those mines and make them mine for me. But it's not just that. I want to own railroads that will allow me to ship my iron to where my factories are located so I can turn that iron into steel. Controlling the supply chain from start to finish is known as vertical integration. And companies also pursued this strategy as well, because it meant that you were not dependent on someone else for any part of your product. You controlled making your product from the raw good all the way up until it was perfectly finished. Another way that companies grew was to borrow a legal structure called a trust. Now, trusts are very old in the English American legal tradition because a trust is nothing more than someone who is put in charge of a person or an organization and holds that organization or that person's money in trust and makes decisions for them. What happens is that businesses adopt this model of trusts so that they can run their businesses more efficiently. So instead of letting your business be run by hundreds of investors who all get a vote in your company, they simply elect a board of trustees. And that board of trustees now makes the decisions for the entire company itself. And another innovation that companies pioneer in this time period is companies owning other companies. So you could have a trust owning a company that is, in fact, the maker of products, but the trust itself doesn't really make anything. And that trust could own multiple companies. This is what will allow a monopoly to flourish. Let's say you've got a board of 10 men making all the decisions for your company. They're able to meet, talk, make a decision pretty quickly. They're able to order all of the people underneath them in the holding companies that they own to follow in that decision. And this allows for what business historians like to point out is solving the problem of coordinating. That is, businesses can be successful and dominate their competition if they can coordinate their actions with all the other parts of the business and make efficient, quick, rapid decisions that enable them to beat the competition. In another lecture that I'm going to do next in a separate recording, we're going to look at how all of these things that we have talked about impacts life in the South. And I'm going to raise the question as to whether or not there is, in fact, a new South that emerges after the Civil War. So join me next time for another part of Lecture 16.